talked about it in letters, and we talked about it on the phone. But how you really feel about it, I don't really know.
What's your take on Cassavetes? 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 Misogynist. Genius. Misogynist. Genius. Misogynist. Genius. Misogynist. Genius. What's your take on Cassavetes? What's your take on Cassavetes? What's your take on Cassavetes?
Welcome to There's Sometimes a Buggy, Irresponsible Opinions About Classic Film. I'm Elise.
I'm Dave. This week, it is our penultimate Setsuko Hara Acteurist Oeuvre-view. You might call this the Akiko.
Would that be a duology?
Yeah, duology. Final two films with Ozu. He only had one more to go after these two, sadly. We'll be talking about Late Autumn from 1960 and The End of Summer from 1961.
So these two films are not as well known as some of the other Ozu's, his other post-war films and some of his other Setsuko Hara films. That's unfortunate, I think.
The Noriko trilogy deserves its place of grandeur, obviously, but these films should be savored.
If you do love the Noriko trilogy, Late Autumn is deeply in dialogue with it.
Yes, absolutely. Just as much as An Autumn Afternoon, which has begun to ascend the ranks of the Ozu filmography. It is a great, great film and his last film, so it makes sense for people to be thinking a lot about that one. But just as important, for sure, is Late Autumn.
The first time I saw Late Autumn, I was really struck by its formal qualities. Didn't maybe respond to it as much as a piece of drama, because it's got some formal qualities that are very prominent. And we can get into that and why it means that Ozu really isn't a realist. I think he is thought of as a formalist, but less so for his content than for his technique. His content is very formalist as well. But this time, I did respond to it more as a drama, albeit one in dialogue with the earlier films, especially Late Spring.
Yeah,
right?
That's the way to handle auteurist criticism.
Just like Henry James is late. Oh, there's the name. It comes so earlier every episode. Just like Henry James's work, or other people with a late style, like David Lynch's work, is always in dialogue with their earlier work, right? Yeah, this time I just absolutely loved it. So I had an interesting reaction to these films as a pairing. I felt that me now at age 45, thinking ahead, hopefully far ahead, to a time when my life might be nearing its end, Late Autumn, which is literally translated as A Calm Autumn Day, is a film I would like to watch a lot at that time, as giving me a sense of reassurance and happiness at the melancholy end of life. And The End of Summer, on the other hand, is a film that I would like to be kept very far away from me as I near my life's end.
So you were not reassured.
The crows?
To
No.
sayings.
No, but after the peasant sayings, all those crows gather around. It was more like a Halloween movie. All those crows gather around, and there's actual ominous music, like Hitchcock's The Birds is about to start.
Yeah, we're like a serious man.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that one later. I agree with you, though. That one, even though it is explicitly about the end of a person's life, does not seem to be aiming to make you feel terribly good about that.
This one, like Late Spring, is about the end of a phase of a person's life.
Yeah.
But it's actually more calm and accepting than Late Spring. Apparently it was based on a novel by Ton Satomi, who also wrote the novel Equinox Flower, which Ozu also made into a film, but that's utterly irrelevant because in every aspect it is so much an Ozu and Noda film that I don't know how they use the novel, but it has been completely remade into their own type of story.
Well, we have no way of knowing what the relationship of that novelist is to Ozu. They may have been deeply inspired by Ozu films.
Could have been like Vertigo. I wrote this so that Ozu would make it.
Very possible.
The final scene with the daughter putting on the traditional wedding garb and how it only works as a reference to the end of late spring. It doesn't have its own self-contained affect.
It's very different. In this one, it's actually a two-shot with her husband.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
He's taking a different approach to it.
But the difference works because we know it's a difference.
Very interesting intertextuality. We'll be referring to it throughout. And the very simple, facile way to describe this film is as an inversion in some ways of late spring, with Setsuko Hara moving up a generation into the Chishu-ryu role, and she is dealing with a situation where her own daughter is past the age at which Japanese society expects young women to get married, and she is expressing a lot of sentiments that would be considered worrisome, that she might just prefer to stay at home in the single-parent household and enjoy the company and comradeship of her mother in this case instead of a father.
The plot is so similar to Late Spring that there is even a trick performed by the mother on the daughter to get her to marry, a pretense that she's going to remarry, that the daughter initially finds very distasteful.
It's different though because she doesn't at all participate in the scheme to the extent even that Chishu-ryu does in Late Spring.
No, but she agrees.
She's not even aware of it most of the time.
Once they actually go through with asking her, she does agree to herself to pretend that this is going to happen. Well, up until this daughter couldn't back out of the marriage. Chishu-ryu can't actually confess ahead of time to his daughter in Late Spring, to Noriko, that he's not really going through with the marriage or she wouldn't leave.
He's also more ambivalent, afraid of giving her any reason to stay because he needs her to stay more.
Maybe, but we'll talk about that as we come to it. Anyway, despite the similarity in plot, one of the reasons it's so divergent from Late Spring is the completely different perspective on the plot, which is provided by this all-male chorus of aging businessmen who are kind of like the bumbling Soviet envoys in Ninotchka, except that what they're bumbling is matchmaking.
And just being patriarchs in general.
In a way, it's like Noda and Ozu creating a meta version of themselves. These men who are matchmaking just like Noda and Ozu are always creating these marital plots.
Yeah.
For these women that obviously fascinate them. These men are spinning a narrative as much as anything else, but they're kind of fucking it up.
It definitely makes you feel that they are frozen in time at the point in their lives when they were all hoping to marry Akiko. Right? They have not fully stepped into the patriarchal role, which was a powerful one in Japan and in most of the West as well in the 1950s, and they don't really inhabit it very well. It's the kind of thing that Ozu explores quite a lot in his films, but this is one, and then again in Autumn Afternoon, he's going to bring all those guys back again with Chishu-ryu at the center of their group.
What has frozen them is not this crush on a goddess, like an unattainable woman who is just Setsuko Hara, the movie star, but the war is what has frozen and traumatized them.
They are the people pushing the plot along throughout.
Up until it stalls because they haven't done it properly, and then a young girl has to step in and fix it, who is
Yuriko. Mariko Okada is the actress, and she will turn up again in An Autumn Afternoon in a great role.
Yeah, she seems to be the younger generation girl that Ozu and Noda are okay with. They're giving her their stamp of approval.
Well, she's in the lineage of the best friend in Late Spring, who is a divorcee already in her mid-20s and is just living her life. And she's telling Setsuko Hara, get married and get rid of him if you don't like him. You don't have to be stuck in this.
But you can't help but feel whether it's intended or not, you can't help but feel that, well, it is intended because it comes up in the very first scene, that a direct comparison is being made between the younger generation and Setsuko Hara, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the younger generation of women, the new kind of girl is found wanting. But then they invent this girl who becomes a deus ex machina that they are willing to meet halfway, sort of. Just like the very first shot of the film, which shows tree branches over over a tower, an iron tower of some sort, maybe a radio tower, you thought, right? Mm-hmm. So the meeting of the modern and the natural.
Well, this is the classic transcendentalist image. You get this all through Walden, the basis of Leo Marx's The Machine in the Garden. I guess it might have some applicability to what Ozu's doing as well, because you get those kind of images a lot.
The feeling that this film of comfort and reassurance that this film conveys to me has a lot to do with the way that he films it. Even more than usual, there are many, many shots of just empty space. But not empty space, empty interiors, and interiors that are in themselves beautiful or just rendered beautiful by his gorgeous use of color.
These are the first color films we've covered in the podcast, so they're the first color Ozus you've seen in quite a while.
Maybe he himself is a little bit dazzled by what these interiors look like in color.
I think that starts right away with Equinox Flower. Mm. I remember I took some screen caps of Equinox Flower when we watched it. So he was doing that right from the start, which is only a couple of years before this. He didn't do any color films until 1958, I believe. In this film, which is fresh in our memory as we watched it today, it really does seem like they could be beautifully composed matte shots that are just dropped in front of the camera to dazzle you, and then all of a sudden you realize, no, this is actually just a set. People are walking through it. Magnificent.
And then a recurring motif, because of the setting at the beginning of the film, is reflections of water, shadows of water on the walls. And again, the camera is just entranced by this natural beauty. And I guess that's another bringing together of nature with culture, the beauty of the interiors with this reflection of the water. In both of these films, there is a great emphasis, I feel like even more than in his black and white post-war films, on diegetic sound. How important it is to him in every scene to use a sound that would be naturally occurring in that setting, whether it's traffic or crickets or whatever it might be. And that becomes part of the texture of the scene. There's just so much texture in all of these scenes.
And let's not forget the return of the oompa music.
Oh, the oompa music comes in right as soon as we realize from their meet cute that Ayako, the daughter, is going to fall in love with Goto.
Yeah.
That's where it comes in.
Yeah, because it does have a more classical sounding score at the beginning, and then it shifts back into the Tokyo Twilight.
Yes, but less of an ironic counterpoint, because this film does have a lot of just comedic elements.
Well, yeah, that's true.
Right.
It's a more typical Ozu film in that regard. So much emotion, but shot through with ironic observations and just plain fun scenes. We begin at a memorial service for Setsuko Hara's husband, who has died 7 years before the beginning of the film. So they meet once a year, and the monks perform a ceremony, they chant, and it's just something that people have to get through. They do seem to enjoy each other's company, but they do all act like it's kind of tiresome to have to endure this religious ritual, right? And the three men that we were talking about, they are the three best friends of the departed man.
Transcendentalism again, or transcendental style. Again, I haven't read Schrader's essay, so I don't know exactly how he uses it, but it could mislead you about Ozu, or maybe it just did me. It's hard to imagine a couple of films more secular than these two films.
Well, transcendentalism in the American context as well, it's very anti-clerical. It has nothing to do with organized religion. It's about deriving meaning from an encounter with nature and other people. So certainly think Ozu falls into that category. There's a lot of resonance to everything that's happening here, but nothing is particularly tied to ritual, and there's no real reverence for ritual.
And certainly no sense of an afterlife.
One of the men doesn't even get there anywhere near on time, and he turns out to be Mamiya, who is the most empathetic of the men, I think. He's Shin Sabura, who we've encountered several times. He was in Temptation. He is in a bunch of other Ozu films that we haven't watched for this, because Setsuko Hara is not in it. A great, great actor.
Yeah, I guess he's kind of the ringleader. He is the one who attempts to execute this plan.
Yeah, he's the one that the film takes most seriously. The other two guys are more goofballs. This guy, you know, it's not like he does much of anything correct, but he is treated like a real person that Ozu's interested in. It makes sense that he would be using Shinsabura in that, because he's extremely good at playing that kind of role. He's like a Kasabon type, but one that you really deeply care about.
Okay, sure.
But all of them have this history of having been in love with this widow, and whenever she's not around and they're together, they talk about how they all had these big plans for her.
Let's talk about how the tone of this film is established, or one of the tones. Because after they have this conversation about the daughter...
That's all going on at the dinner that they're having together. So while the two women are with them, Setsuko Hara and her daughter, they come at her point blank with the idea that it's time for her to think about getting married. And one of the men says that he definitely has a prospect for her. Tries to get her to...
we were just discussing.
No.
Isn't it him?
It's the other guy. The guy with the glasses. Right? And he fails.
Oh, right. Because he immediately fails. We don't even get to see that suitor.
No, he gets home and he talks to his wife and she says, well, he's already getting married.
Right. Anyway,
Dumbass.
As soon as the two... That is what she says. As soon as the women leave, then they immediately start talking about whether the young girl or the mother is hotter.
And they're pretty agreed that, of course, Akiko is the superior woman in their eyes.
They've been drinking this whole time, and they're still drinking.
Yeah.
So all this goes on, they just get drunker and drunker. Then they move on to the, what do you call, hostess?
Oh, yeah, they're
the
very
hostess.
Insulting to this woman.
The
They
hostess
develop this whole
arrives.
code. This is kind of sacred fountish, right? Like, they developed this theory on the fly of men who marry extremely wonderful women have to balance that out by dying early.
I thought the implication was that they are having too much sex.
Well, I don't know about that. Maybe that's part of it.
Yes, because then they start talking about this overweight hostess crushing her spouse to death during sex with scissor legs.
Yeah, I know, but then they say that he's going to live forever. So obviously that's not the case. It's more about cosmic scales balancing. So you get...
I don't know, there's a lot of very low-toned sex jokes in this
sure.
film, so I kind of thought that it started here.
Well, that joke is definitely a sex joke, but I'm not sure if they're saying that you would kill yourself having sex with Setsuko Hara.
We'll leave it to the viewers of the film to decide.
Probably thinking about having sex with Setsuko Hara all the time is enough to cause you to burst a blood vessel.
Well, as we're going to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, the way that the men are thinking about Setsuko Hara, the apparently eternal virgin, is not very holy.
No.
They really want to have sex with her.
Sure, they always did.
And they still do. And they think she actually looks better than ever. I guess she's supposed to be about 45 in this film, if her daughter is 24 and she got married when she was 20.
Yeah.
And Setsuko Hara herself was, around 40, 41? So actually a little bit younger than what she's playing, but
in that range.
In the range. I probably haven't I hope I haven't changed that much in the last 5 years. So the plot is off. We see these men at home with their wives, all of whom know about and comment on their lifelong interest in Setsuko Hara, some of which they've gotten from each other as stories. They're all ganged up against these useless husbands.
The thing is, these guys get drunk all the time, as
Yes.
we've seen already, and then they talk about their feelings about Setsuko Hara with anyone that will listen, including their wives. But they do always try to say, no, that wasn't me, that was the other guy. It's only the two, right? Because the professor is a widower, so he doesn't have a wife to tease him about this, and that's going to leave him in a position to take a very different role vis-a-vis Setsuko Hara than the other two guys.
We also see little snippets of family life that apparently some reviewers, according to Wikipedia here, found very endearing. I thought that these are Ozu and Noda's most sour and cynical depictions of family life to date. The families just absolutely can't seem to stand each other, although it's funny.
Yeah.
And it's not, heavy, it's not angsty, but they really just are very annoyed with each other, and children are shaking their fists at the parents are telling their children who aren't doing anything wrong at all to get lost and go to your bedroom.
Each of them has a daughter about whom they feel nothing akin to what Chishiuryu and Setsuko Hara had in late spring, right? There's no connection there at all. These are just burdens. They
Yeah.
don't have any special feeling about them. They don't feel like they're friends or particularly lovable or anything. And the marriages are just, everyone seems to know everyone's settled for each other here. And they've made their peace with that. Nobody seems to be angry.
They just make jokes about it.
Yeah.
To each other, to the wives to each other, and to their husbands.
Yeah.
The husbands, they have to make up for whatever scraps of patriarchal authority they have by sort of taking all of this and bearing it, right? And they just get their own by getting drunk and blurting out the truth.
Yeah, it's amazing. And these guys, honestly, the darkest part of the film is when they're at the bar, when they get to the realization that someone is going to have to try to marry Setsuko Hara so that her daughter will be released to be free to marry. The two guys who are still married are saying very, very earnestly, I really wish I was in your position. So they're saying, I wish my wife was dead.
Sure, yeah. I didn't think of it that way, but true.
I mean, it's very genial, that scene, but they're actually, that's what they're saying. There's no other way to read it.
Most the families come to life and exhibit a sort of solidarity or pleasure in each other is the scene when Hirayama tells his son about his plan, and his son is absolutely delighted.
No, that's going to be a hot stepmom around the house for a while.
And also, Dad, frankly, I'll get you off my hands.
Yeah.
It'll be great all around. So they're kind of like the youngsters in that Nerusa movie that we watched.
Daughters, wives, and a mother.
Okay, so this plot gets going, so I guess we can talk about how Goto fits into all of this.
So this is Mamiya's great stroke of genius, if he has any in the film. He's the most sympathetic of the three men. He steps in when the first guy's plan fails immediately. He decides, well, there's a guy at my office. I think he's a really winning personality. Everybody loves him. He's just right for you. He's 29.
Actually, this bit of matchmaking that he does is actually perfect. It's genius. Immediately as soon as you see the guy, this young actor that I'm sure we've seen in other...
A golf club husband in An Autumn Afternoon. So he's Chishiryu's eldest.
As soon as we see him with his floppy fringe that is actually described earlier, Setsuko Hara doesn't think anything of him. She just doesn't notice him at all when they pass him in the elevator, right? He's not good enough for her. But he's good enough for the daughter. In fact, he's a perfect match. And as soon as we see him, we know before they've even looked at each other that these two are going to like each other.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary sequence because they've been through all of this and the daughter, Ayako, has said categorically, just forget about all these matchmaking plans. I know we were laughing about it at dinner the other day, but actually I'm just going to blanketly say no to all of them. So don't bring any pictures, don't bring any detective reports on their background.
But completely unlike Noriko in Late Spring, she adds to her mother as well that I'm fine the way I am, I'm happier with you, I don't want to be matchmaked, but it'll be a different story when I fall in love, and I don't want them to show me any pictures, implicitly, because that I might find somebody attractive, and then it's going to be a lot harder for me to make this sacrifice.
So she'd rather it just happen by some kind of fluke, if it's going to happen at all, but she is ready for that possibility. And yes, in Late Spring, Noriko is just not interested.
She has no romantic interest in any men.
No. Mamiya, he really takes a chance here. He does a very, on the surface, gauche thing by saying, hey, you're both in my office at the moment. Why don't I tell you that this is the young woman that rejected you as a suitor?
He actually does her nagging for her.
Yeah.
And it completely works. And she's also so embarrassed that it kind of like breaks the ice between them.
Yeah.
It's perfect. It's perfectly judged.
Also, it gives him an opportunity to demonstrate that he is a pretty wonderful guy. Like, he doesn't act hostile towards her. He meets her in the hallway later, and he just acts friendly.
Yeah.
So this is a really unusual guy. Most people would be offended and would at least not be willing to get right into pleasantries with her after that. But yeah, he is. But he says, say hi to this colleague of hers. So they work at offices that are probably not that far apart. So they have a friend in common. And all of this comes out, this kind of reminded me of Early Spring, where we have a lot of scenes of the office chums going on hikes. The next major development happens there when they're going on a prenuptial office retreat or hike. Everyone goes to a cabin and they're playing games. The guy, the friend of Goto, says, says, "Why did you reject my friend? What's wrong with you? He's cool. You can take it back. I'll reintroduce you." She doesn't say yes in that scene, but obviously it happens because we see them on a date later.
Sure.
And that's the genesis of it. The friend is going on their honeymoon, and Ayako and Yuriko go up onto the roof to see if the friend is going to actually flash a bouquet of flowers for them.
Yes, and she doesn't, and that's when Yuriko expresses a melancholy sense familiar to us from the earlier friend scenes in the Noriko trilogy of friendship for women just being a way to pass the time.
Yeah, is it just a stopgap and then everyone retreats to their nuclear households and never talks to each other again?
Well, clearly that's not going to be the way it is for her.
No.
And there's no indication that she's going to get married to anyone in the course of this film?
No. She lives upstairs from the restaurant with her family, and
That's right.
she's not interested in anyone in particular right now. It doesn't seem like
she's
it.
a bit lower class, I guess, compared to the rest of them. She is a bit of a remarkable, eccentric character.
Oh, I love her, man. She punches the air when she's, like, thinking about these awful traditions. She's like, fuck that. Punch. She's definitely the stronger personality. Ayako is following her lead a lot of the time.
Oh,
but
she's so much more interesting, and that's so funny because Noriko in Late Spring is, of course, so idealized by the film. Lovely Yuriko gets to say some things that you kind of want to say to Noriko in Late Spring if she weren't played by Setsuko Hara, like, my god, you're acting like such a baby. Why don't you grow up and let your mother live her life?
Actually, again, I do want to make the argument that this character, Yuriko, is prefigured by the friend in Late Spring, who says a lot of the same stuff.
Well, not quite as bluntly.
Maybe not, but she doesn't let Setsuko Hara off that easily. She really tells her off a few times.
Yeah. This daughter, Ayako, is just pretty colorless, and she and her young man, the typical novel young couple that just aren't a very much, or Shakespeare comedy young couple, who just aren't of very much interest to anybody, like the young couple in the background of Much Ado About Nothing, right?
Yeah, well, they're very pleasant, and they're
pleasant and handsome.
They're like Marx Brothers
nice.
romantic leads, too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everybody else is
Far more interesting.
Yeah.
This is what I meant by this movie being so formally interesting because of the way that the meta element of these matchmakers creating the plot and bungling the plot and other characters having to step in and fix the plot, but also the way it just rearranges the elements of the Noriko trilogy and comes up with something completely different,
Yeah,
right?
it's a genius work, once again, to put Setsuko Hara all of a sudden in the mother role.
Well, like I said, the main thing that accomplishes in this film is to present this contrast between this still idealized woman and a younger generation.
And there's so many callbacks as well. Some of it is stuff that's referred to that we don't see on camera, right? Like where Taguchi, when he goes to her to broach the subject of her getting married, he says all she did was talk about her dead husband and it derailed everything I was going to say. And then she peeled this apple in one strip for me and gave it to me, like,
with her gorgeous white hands.
Yeah, and he ate the apple.
Yeah, it's a very different apple than Shishiryu's apple.
She just has so much more life force to her. For Shishiryu, you really do get the sense that all of the joy that he had in life was reflected from his daughter, and now he is left without that.
Well, that's why we're going to have to talk about when these scenes are repeated, how they have such a different meaning. So let's start talking about her relationship with her daughter. So they do have several scenes together that are very pleasant and cozy, and much more so for me anyway than in Late Spring. Very relatable as, yes, this is the kind of relationship that a mother and daughter can have together when they're alone or at certain periods of your life. In adolescence, for example, when you're making time to spend with each other. It is a very pleasant kind of life that they're leading together, and you can understand why the daughter sincerely wouldn't want this to end.
Right, but it never feels like a substitute for a romance the way it does in Late Spring. Or never feels like it's as exalted as romantic love.
No, they've got this cozy little life together. I guess they have sold the house and moved into an apartment. I guess this husband has not left a lot of money.
No, we don't know exactly what he did. Presumably he was some other kind of business guy. Although one of them's a professor. He could have been an academic as well. Who knows?
Akiko is, I don't know if she's trying to bring in extra money by this teaching job that she has, teaching.
Yeah, she must be.
As a seamstress, teaching dressmaking, that's what she's doing.
And she clearly didn't have much money of her own coming into the marriage because she worked as a counter person at a drugstore when all these guys were courting her. She has an uncle, which is Chishiryu. The ubiquitous Chishiryu has a very small part in this one and an even smaller part in the end of summer, but he does show up a couple of times. He lives in the country and runs a kind of bed and breakfast place.
For me, because of the plot and because this mother-daughter relationship is so much less exalted, it starts reading an awful lot like Stella Dallas. I brought that up, a possible Stella Dallas reference at the end of Tokyo Twilight, and we know that Ozu loved Vidor, so it's entirely possible that and that both he and Noda loved American film, so it's entirely possible that that film got into their imaginations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just in that the daughter is, as I said before, making a sacrifice by staying with her mother this way, and therefore can be convinced or tricked into no longer making it. But her particular sacrifice is interesting in that she has decided to have this romance without getting married.
I agree with you to some extent, but I feel like Stella Dallas is a different order of magnitude, the obsession. Like, that is a really strong relationship between two very well-defined characters that are... There's nothing regular about that mother-daughter relationship, right? I mean, Stella Dallas...
You don't think so?
Such an outcast in the world that the film puts her in. The intensity of the bond between the mother and daughter there, several orders of magnitude more fraught.
But there's got to be something here, because the daughter is willing to not marry in order to make her mother happy.
I understand that, but in Stella Dallas, it's like her mother really is going to be isolated completely if Laurel leaves. She doesn't have any other suitors except for the drunken Ed Munn, who's probably dead by the end of the movie.
I don't know, who does Setsuko Hara have at the end of this movie other than Yuriko volunteering to get on her?
But that's because that's her choice. Any man that's not married would be happy to marry her. And we see that in the movie. She's not a laughingstock like Stella Dallas is.
Well, Stella Dallas wasn't always a laughingstock, and she does say at a certain point that she has lost interest in men.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So there's definitely an element of choice in her being alone too.
No, I agree, but she's
still Barbara Stanwyck, and she could still attract a man, even if she dresses silly when she's trying to impress people.
No, I understand that, but I do think that Stella's life is a lot sadder than Setsuko Hara's life is in this film.
Well, the only reason that Setsuko Hara's life isn't as sad as Stella Dallas's is because she's Setsuko Hara. I mean, we have to talk about what that means.
She doesn't need approval or anyone, really. She's got her own self-contained life force, which we've been talking about since the beginning of our series.
Yeah, whereas, Barbara Stanwyck can play all sorts of different things, but it's about what she's being asked to represent, Setsuko Hara, in this movie.
Yeah, I agree.
And in all of her Ozu movies, practically. Not Tokyo Twilight so much.
No,
even that a little bit, though, in the relationship that she has with Shishiryu.
Really does change all of the variables in the equation when you put Setsuko Hara in that parental role.
Their life together is kind of more on the level of the family life that Noriko has in Tokyo Story, right? It's not intense, but it's pleasant. It's a pleasant kind of life together that could continue, and there's no particular reason that it needs to stop. Just like the friendships, as Yuriko is describing them. Why do these just have to stop because you get married?
Yeah.
Why does marriage have to happen? Eternal question of the Noriko movies.
Or why does marriage have to consume everything else, right? Why does a wifely role have to cut you off from everything else? Because a man, it's not the same, obviously. And they have all their business friends.
They have their business friends, but the business friends seem to not have the same kind of nourishing relationship that the women have with each other, and that Setsuko Hara and Shishiryu have with each other in Late Spring. Drunk and smoke and seem to be numbing themselves against the misery of their home lives.
Yeah, but I don't feel like they've lost anything. That's what their relationships were like when they were teenagers and college students as well. They were one-upping each other, insulting each other, and all trying to seduce Setsuko Hara.
Whereas Ozu and Noda seem to imagine something, as I say, more emotionally nourishing going on between women.
Something that aces the Bechdel test, right? It has nothing to do with men. It's far beyond anything men even understand, and it's wonderful. Even though it's quite contentious, right? Akiko flips out on Noriko.
It's wonderful, though, because Noriko just keeps, like, sticking her tongue out at her and making faces at her and saying, fine then, be that way. Oh, look, I'm going to eat the sushi.
Yeah.
But she's obviously not at all put out by this. She's continuing to act on her friend's behalf through all of this and do what she thinks is going to make her happy.
Yeah.
Be her envoy with the men.
No, it's the best case scenario for a friendship when one friend is not thinking too clearly, the other friend has to do the thinking for both of them.
So she's, as we said, she sorts out this whole plot and realizes that what happened is that our main matchmaker could not bring himself to bring up their proposal for Akiko's husband, right?
Just totally thrown off his game by the nostalgic talk about the dead man and that apple.
And again, of course, this can't be represented because only in the abstract can we ever believe that a Setsuko Hara Ozu character had this wonderful relationship with a man. We can't even see that. We can't even see. She has like 2 little lines about what a great father he was later, but
she does say that, I'm happy living with the memory of your father, but that sounds more like a place marker for I'll be just fine communing with myself.
Better than when I was with your father, if
yeah.
we even believe that really happened. Hirayama, I felt really quite sorry for him.
Oh yeah.
When he was talking to his son, and they both thought what a great idea this was, and he immediately perks up and is so much happier, and I felt that there was a lot of potential for pathos there, but immediately that is quashed by his habit of going to the toilet and masturbating whenever they talk about him getting married to Akiko.
Yeah, when he starts to think it's gonna happen, he can't control himself.
And he's the professor. We know based on that he's not at her level.
Oh, definitely not.
Just in case
everyone knows that.
You needed an illustration of why no real man is at her level. This Ozu and Noda give you the ultimate illustration.
Yeah.
In their inimitably vulgar, late-style fashion.
Jaunts off to the toilet.
Just heading to the toilet after they start talking about how peppy and happy he looks.
Well, he's got an itch now.
Oh, right, the itch. Yes, the itch that his maid can't scratch.
Definitely not.
So, and even that conversation by itself tells us that the way he thinks of a wife, even Akiko, is as a maid that he can have sex with.
Sure. These men have very limited imaginations, social imaginations here, and interpersonal imagination. The same actor will play the member of the male chorus in An Autumn Afternoon who has married a much younger woman, and there's an extended joke about him having a heart attack during sex, and everyone believes it, and then...
Oh, you know what? Maybe I was thinking I was attributing sexual content to their discussion at the beginning of this film because I was remembering that joke.
It is very clearly stated that he needs pills to keep up with his young wife, and he's just going to die eventually.
I was blending them together in my memory. Yeah. Yeah, that's way more explicit. All right, so then we get the end scenes. Longtime listeners of this podcast will know that I often say the same thing about my emotional reactions to film, which is I'm watching this, I'm analyzing it, we're going through the emotional stuff, I'm saying to myself, oh, it's just not going to affect me this time, it's just not going to affect me because I'm thinking about it too analytically, and then all of a sudden, bam, the tears start pouring. And for me, they happened with the reprise scene of the daughter getting married, but everything leading up to it, all these little scenes of them together, even though they're far less transcendent.
Well, it's just very different, right? Because in Late Spring, we never see this husband, fiance that looks like Gary Cooper. He's not in the images that you see of Setsuko Hara in the traditional wedding costume. In this film, it's just a much more balanced portrayal. In some ways, that makes it more relatably sad, I guess, right? Like, it's more about this inevitable problem in human existence that you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't live both ways that you want to live. You have to choose. and do something, and that means that you can't do the other thing, when we would all prefer to keep doing all the things we like.
What I meant was the scenes of Setsuko Hara and her daughter leading up to the wedding.
Oh, leading up to the wedding. Yeah, like the scenes at the uncle's inn are wonderful. It makes you think and not think at the same time of the scenes in Late Spring where they're on their final trip before she's getting married. It's
so different.
Yeah.
But again, more relatable, like that moment that describes what the pinnacle of happiness for Ozu is, where she says to her daughter, "I will always remember being here in this beautiful place, eating sweet beans."
Just sweet beans.
Sweet beans with you. And at the beginning, too, with the men at the dinner talking about, they had this long discussion of pickled vegetables.
Yep.
Talking about how much more these things mean to us the older we get, the taste of pickled vegetables. And then they list the different vegetables.
They love all those different vegetables. I understand it.
What we get a sense of towards the end, or what I get a sense of towards the end, is that this end phase for Setsuko Hara here is her loss, is that she's come to the end of making more wonderful memories. And that's a real significant loss. Now she's going to live on her memories.
Yeah.
Her daughter is still the source of joy in her life, right? And that is going to be gone. But she does have this ability to replace it with all of these wonderful experiences that she's stored up, right?
Yeah, I think it's significant, and this is the most significant dialogue point with Late Spring, that in that scene at the inn, before they go to bed, in Late Spring, it's all about Chishu trying to convince himself and his daughter that she's going to have a wonderful life with her new husband as long as she just sticks at it and doesn't let it get her too down for the first 5 or 6 years. And in this movie, it's all about Setsuko Hara assuring her daughter that she's going to be fine. So in both scenes, it winds up being about what is Setsuko Hara's life going to be like? Because the daughter, we all understand, she's going to have a good marriage, and Setsuko Hara doesn't give her any kind of pep talk about it or anything. There's no need for it.
Because I've forgotten that the structure of Late Spring is that we don't know what any of this has cost Shishirio until the final scene.
That's right.
Right. So yeah, that's very, very different. But when the daughter, the reason the tears started pouring when the daughter is getting married is because I felt like at that moment, after all those little scenes with her mother, it builds up to this moment of the daughter, perhaps, realizing that she has lost such a special mother.
Yeah.
And again, that's not going to be anything near the end of her life here, but it is a significant loss that she registers, right?
Yeah, which is totally how it should be, right? You have to be a sociopath to move out of a home that you've been living in for your entire life and not feel like something big is changing about your life.
Well,
even though you
if you
want
do
to
have a wonderful relationship with a wonderful mother.
Yeah.
But, even if you have an okay relationship and complicated relationship with your parents, as most of us do, it's still, as I talked about in the Late Spring episode, it's still quite the transition.
Yeah.
But then we get the final scenes with Setsuko Hara, and should talk about how those differ from Shishirio going home in Late Spring after the wedding.
Well, there is kind of an echo there too, right? In Late Spring, it's at the bar. The friend who is kind of like the forerunner of Yuriko comes to see him at the bar and tells him that she'll visit him sometimes.
But we don't believe her. And I do believe Yuriko.
Yeah, I think Yuriko's definitely going to visit
I'm not sure that Yuriko's even getting married.
I don't think she's getting married, no. Well, not anytime soon, no. And it's significant, I think, that her mother is dead, right?
And she talks about that a few times. She really
likes
her
stepmother, but she also really likes Setsuko Hara.
Who I guess is more like an idealized memory of your mother.
Right, and we do get the wedding scene. It's got so many different notes in it, including Hirayama scowling, thinking about the fact that he had this chance to marry Akiko, at least in his mind and the minds of his friends, and it didn't come to pass.
Right, and before we get the scenes with Setsuko Hara going home, we get another dinner with these friends.
Yep, he says he's given up on that now.
And they want to launch themselves on a new matchmaking progress, which for me...
They realize they love this. It's so much fun.
Again, see, this is where I think it's a representation of Noda and Ozu. They're like, oh, let's make another movie like this. What can we do next time? This is their reason for continuing to live, these old drunk guys that Ozu and Noda were. We're just going to make another matchmaking movie, another Noriko movie.
Well, they did. An Autumn Afternoon.
Just a reason to keep going to the end. Okay, so at home, after she talks to Yuriko, then we get some melancholy scenes of her alone in this little apartment, which is more reminiscent of Noriko in Tokyo Story, the apartment that we've seen, that we know she's going home to.
Yeah.
But then we get the Stella Dallas smile at the end.
She's gonna be okay.
To me, she's smiling over what she has accomplished by marrying her daughter. That's why it's so similar to Stella Dallas, that ending note.
Oh yeah, that part I agree with you, but I don't feel entirely sure that Stella Dallas's life is gonna be okay after that
Yeah,
fade
but
out.
Fedor wants us to believe against all rational conviction that she does have this inner light, this inner resource that is very mysterious that we don't really have access to, right? That we don't even understand, but
Yeah.
she has it. That's what his heroines are like. We said that with Ruby Gentry, too.
No, I agree with that, but it's gonna be rough. It's gonna be rough. And she's also cut off forever from her daughter. She can never see her again. She can't appear at the wedding.
Well, Ozu would like to have us believe that this is what happens when daughters get married.
But we know that that's not quite true. They won't be able to see each other all the time.
Have their life together.
But they're going to see each other. They're not even going to be living in different towns. So it should be all right to some extent.
Well, then what is the meaning of all of this if she's just going to be fine anyway?
I think it's what you said. I think that was a nice encapsulation. The idea that maybe she's not planning on building any more crucial memories.
Right.
She's got enough now, and she's going to enjoy the syllabub of memory for the rest of her life.
But it's terrible to think that that part of your life of creating new joys is over.
Yeah.
Luckily, I don't see any reason why... Well, don't die on me. Why that should end for us.
And here again, she is playing Akiko, albeit a far less crucial Akiko to this second film, The End of Summer.
So, with this film, I noticed on Letterboxd has a kind of unique reputation among Ozu films in that a lot of people seem to think it brings comedy and tragedy together in a way that's different than his other films. A lot of the others are either predominantly tragic or predominantly comic or very melancholy, mixed with comedy, but this one, I guess, has what you could call tragic elements. Very, very sad ones, anyway. Death, in fact. And a lot of crows.
The death of a comic figure.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. Not in a Falstaff type way, though.
But that's how those two aspects are brought together. It's in the person
it's
of
true.
the dad.
And then we have the more typical Ozu movie plot kind of off on one side doing its own thing. I think it might be useful to think about this one, even though tonally it's extremely different in relation to Tokyo Twilight, both in a little bit in the way the father's behavior affects the family, and also in the way there seem to be two separate movies going on. We talked about how the main character in Tokyo Twilight, the tragic young girl, seems to be almost in a separate movie from Setsuko Hara and Shishiryu.
Okay, I
And
see
in a
what you mean there.
completely different way. That's also the case in this movie with Akiko off to one side with Noriko, all played by the daughter in Late Autumn.
Yeah, so here they are an older and younger sibling, but they have a similar closeness to them. Maybe even more closeness to them because it's offset by this whole other plot that they're not particularly involved in, at least on camera. In theory, they are. They're part of this family that's dealing with this dad.
And they show up when he has his collapses, and they're at the funeral, and the father very early on mentions his interest in their love lives.
He's preoccupied with the problem of remarrying his widowed Akiko and marrying the getting a little bit too old for marriage for the first time Noriko.
I don't know that they even interact, though, the father and those daughters.
Well, they're in scenes together where everyone's there, but no, I don't remember ever seeing them speak to each other.
I guess what really struck me about this film on the first viewing, this whole plot with the father, Manbel, is how every attempt seems to be made to squeeze as much meaning out of the scenes that he's in as is humanly possible. I don't mean that, I should make myself clear, that sounds like I'm saying gathering meaning, creating meaning, but I mean the opposite.
You mean it resists meaning?
Yeah, it just gets so absolutely the dialogue and the action is just like taken to an extreme of Noda and Ozu's writing of insignificance. And to have that juxtaposed with this man's death and then the extremely unusually ominous ending felt very brutal and very depressing. I mean, much more so than the final Ozu film, An Autumn Afternoon, which, if anything, is far more depressing, but in its very heartbreakingness, feels more meaningful.
Oh, yeah, definitely. This is a different
This is
kind
a
of
strange sort of experiment, this one.
This is his Coen Brothers film. Right? No, wait, I think I mentioned earlier, in terms of ominous visuals, the Crow finale here does make you think of a serious man with a cancer diagnosis and tornado. That's the end of that film.
So, insofar as there's any meaning to be got out of the juxtaposition of these two very sketchy plots, the Akiko Noriko one and the one with the comic patriarch, the comic tragic patriarch, like the philosophical idea that seems to be guiding this film is that the only thing to live for is your individual happiness, and when you're dead, then that's completely over and there is nothing else. I mean, both Noriko and her father are, I guess, torn between a sense of family responsibility and their personal happiness, but it is left for us in that case to understand for ourselves the difference between their cases.
Well, I think ultimately she's a much more substantial, significant person who has a real impact on someone else's life, and he does not. I don't think that the film is prescribing anything in particular. I think it's more describing.
Characters make statements along those lines.
Oh, well, definitely that a major factor in what you do with your life should be assent rather than doing things out of duty, for sure. But I don't think that there is any one way that that is being shown here, or that there's one universal outcome.
I don't know that, unusually for Ozu, I don't know that the film presents any method of happiness other than this impulse gratification on the father's part.
No, I don't think that that's quite true, because I do think that what's going on with the sisters, they're deriving a great deal of meaning from being of help to each other.
Well, that's what I'm saying, talking about the difference between the individual cases, even if very broadly you could see them making similar choices or dealing with similar dichotomies.
Well, yeah, I think it's saying, sure, you should primarily base your life decisions on doing what you want, but be prepared to deal with the consequences. If you want to behave like this old man, you're just going to become a puff of cremated smoke and nobody cares.
It's interesting to contrast him to the mother in Tokyo Twilight, who we said does seem like, although her decision had bad consequences, very bad consequences for her family, doesn't seem to be judging her, the film, and it does seem like, although she knows the full extent of those bad consequences and that her one daughter is dead and the other daughter hates her, still she seems like she is mentally sound enough that she is going to be okay and still be able to have a life and not be crushed with self-blame. But she certainly, in distinct contrast to Manbell, she certainly has regrets, and that presents us with a life that is more substantial and meaningful than this man's, despite the fact that he is enjoying himself so much, and despite the fact that there's a lot of pleasure to be gained by watching him just say fuck everything. And I have no regrets.
He is a perfect solipsist. He really is using everyone around him as a prop. And that's not what the mother in Tokyo Twilight is doing. She may have abandoned one family and started something totally new, but she embarked upon that with a goal and an actual interest in the person that she started this new life with, presumably. And we even see it in what's going on with her and her business partner. Like, they have a kind of a fun relationship with some give and take there. We never see anything like that from the dad in The End of Summer. The most striking thing to me about his plotline really is this amazing undecidability of the question of whether this woman that he has met on the train really is even the person that he thinks she is.
Well, everyone else seems to think that she is.
Yeah, but they don't know. All they know is that he had an affair with someone a long time ago when he was actually married to his wife when she was alive. He may have fathered a child back then. That all ended, presumably because it was too unstable to continue. And then he has rekindled this flame for her. But it has no meaning whatsoever to this woman he has projected all of that onto. And any normal person would realize that, because the audience certainly realizes that she's just telling him what he wants to hear. And so is this pretend daughter.
No, she's not at all. Actually, whether she is really his daughter or not, she is perfectly his spiritual daughter, in that she is also a perfect solipsist. And all he ever hears from her is, buy me a mink stole.
Yeah, but that's what he wants from this relationship.
And it also seems to be what he deserves from
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, watching it could be true, in which case it never meant much to this woman in the first place, or she could just be taking advantage of the fact that he thinks she's this person. You know, like a Cornell Woolrich plot or something. It's like,
and the daughter more or less doesn't care.
And the daughter certainly says, I thought I had a different father before. And the mother's like, well, yeah, of course you did.
But the absolute beauty of this solipsistic outlook, whether expressed by her or by him, is her statement, but what does it matter? I'm here now. I was born. I'm here now. Who cares who my father is?
Yeah, exactly.
Not interested in pursuing it any further than that.
Yeah, and the father feels the same way about that. And he's just, you can't spoil his day because he doesn't take any notice of you or anyone else around him. He just does what he wants. Although, when it suits him, he can pick up details of behavior, like when he notices that he's being trailed by his underlings.
Or he can even have the nicest time, for as long as it lasts, which isn't long, that we see any grandparent having with any grandchild, especially grandson, in Ozu's movies that I have watched.
Yeah, but it's very telling that that's the most we see of him having anything like some kind of a meeting of the minds with anyone, and it's a 5-year-old boy, and that's what he acts like.
An obnoxious Ozu 5-year-old boy.
Yeah, they act like 2 5-year-old boys playing, and 5-year-old boys don't take much notice of each other's minds, I will tell you.
So I wonder what made them, we can't know what made them decide to do this at this point. But it's an interesting experiment.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. And the movie, we should try to pull back here and take a look at the structure of it as a whole. It starts out, you might be forgiven for thinking it's going to be another movie that focuses entirely on everyone trying to push Setsuko Hara into getting married, because that's the first scene, certainly. She's lured into this meeting with a potential suitor. Her uncle has recruited this businessman.
This potential suitor is almost a perfect solipsist, too.
Yeah.
But they often are in Ozu's movies.
Yeah, well, this suitor definitely feels like
he is like one of the suitors from the last movie. That's what I mean, Late Autumn.
But he feels like a spiritual cousin of the dad as well, for sure. Yeah.
Can you find me a cow painting?
Yeah. So there's this whole interaction with him at the bar, and it's clear that she's got no interest in this guy. She really wishes her uncle hadn't done this. The guy is madly in love with her immediately.
Well, he says he's in love at first sight.
Yeah. Well, he says that later, when he gets stood up. One of her funniest scenes ever, although she has many, is her decision to excuse herself to make a phone call. And the way the film is edited, it does seem like she has just snuck off and escaped. Now, we hear later that she must have gone back and at least said, sorry, I have to go home. My sister is visiting me and she can't be around for very long, so I want to make sure to be there.
So yeah, this is the kind of infinitely sly comedy of this movie. Painful comedy.
Like the previous Akiko, this Setsuko Hara character is a mother, although her child is much younger in this one, so she's not worried about this young boy getting married.
This version of her character, her Ozu character, except for these comic scenes of this man's worship of her, there really is no drama involving her at all, because it never gets to the point of there being dramatic conflict around whether she's going to accept this man or not. It's pure comedy.
Yeah, she just deflects him completely. She just doesn't show up to the next meeting. Find out that all she ever said was that she'd try to be there.
Yeah, but in between, her matchmaker shows up at the art gallery where she works and asks her if she's found the cow painting yet, and she's like, I'm still looking.
Yeah. I'll get back to you. All the drama for her is bound up with whether she can help Noriko make a good decision for her life. And she has to be around during her father's illness, but it's really not something that seems to be preoccupying her all that much. much.
I thought, since this is our last Setsuko Hara Ozu episode, and maybe the last substantial parts for her.
Again, we have 2 more Setsuko Hara films coming up, but we've never seen these, and we have no idea. She may be very important to the films, or she may just have cameos. We don't really know.
And they have enormous casts, so yeah, we have no idea. So I thought it would be interesting to fold, in considering what Setsuko Hara brought to Ozu's films, to fold the final film into it, not featuring Setsuko Hara, but definitely is related to those other films in interesting ways. Another reprise of Late Spring, again with a father and daughter, so more closely parallel than Late Autumn.
And Shishiryu,
And
back
Shishiryu,
again.
yes, as the dad.
In the 2 that we talked about this week, Shishiryu had very minor roles. In Late Autumn, he's the uncle who owns the inn. In this one, he's just a guy who is working down by the river, who has a couple of scenes where he makes philosophical statements and looks at the cremation chimney.
Obviously, Setsuko Hara is too old to play the daughter, so she doesn't. And the result of that is that the movie barely touches on the daughter at all. It's all about the father's perspective this time. That also means that Shishiryu, and not Setsuko Hara for once, seems like the directorial or screenwriter's stand-in. It's kind of an alternate universe in which there never was a possibility for these two to go on happily forever, because there is a very notable problem with this father, which is that he's a raging alcoholic.
And damaged war veteran.
Well, yeah, relatedly, a damaged war veteran. We see in the whole plot of his encounter and his and his friends' encounter with their old teacher, the Gourd, we see the future that he envisions for himself if he lets this relationship with his daughter continue, which is one in which they despise each other.
We've talked so much about how there are so many variations on Late Spring, but really Late Spring is the only one that presents this magical father-daughter relationship that seems like maybe it shouldn't be tampered with. Like, you feel like the natural course of life should adjust itself to this stunning reality presented by the film, where they are in such sync and they're having such a great time that it really doesn't make sense for her to do anything else and for him to talk her into doing anything else.
We said there's an undecidability about it, that we don't know what the future holds for her, so we don't know if after she spends her 5 years adjusting to marriage, she ultimately will have a more fulfilling life than she would have had with her father, which is what he thinks, or not. But ultimately it doesn't matter to him, because the film ends on the note of the impact for him. And the impact for him in this film is the same, despite the fact that they do not share this magical mutual bond. But for me, the emphasis falls more on, he seems more like a direct heir of Noriko in Tokyo Story, the Noriko of the cri de coeur about inessuageable loneliness, and by far the bleakest version of Noriko that we ever see, who's going to go home to that fucking apartment. She is not this she's not like the Akiko of Late Autumn, who we feel this warm, glowing reassurance that she has a rich life behind her that she's going to be able to draw on. And it's interesting, given what Setsuko Hara often represents in his films, that is the last happy assessment of a person's life that Ozu presents us with.
Yes, the last 2 films are pretty grim.
But Noriko, I think, is a soulmate of Shishiryu and a predictor of Shishiryu in this film. His final, well, almost his final words, I think he babbles and sings that stupid army song again, that stupid march,
he does.
or
He
Navy
sings...
march, or whatever it is.
He sings most of the lyrics of the Navy March as his son tells him to go to bed.
His son tells him to go to bed, don't die on me, I'll make you breakfast in the morning. Like, his son is an oath, but he's making a really big effort here for him.
Well, we've seen how little the son cares for doing any domestic tasks, but he's going to have to learn, and he seems to be willing.
But Shishiryu's comment on that is to say out loud, I'm all alone now.
Yep.
All alone. So this not particularly special relationship with his daughter is the only thing tethering him to any kind of happiness or mental stability. And he gives this up. She just was this little spark of joy in his life that he couldn't get anywhere else.
The reason he gives it up, the Gourd is essential to that, right? Because he sees that the Gourd's daughter, who's into her 40s maybe at this point, it's Haruko Sugimara in one of her saddest roles, is
She just stares and weeps.
pretty grim, and he just figures, if that's the cost, if I'm going to turn her into that, then it's not worth it. I'll hate myself. The gourd clearly hates himself. Now, I don't want to go too far talking about An Autumn Afternoon, because I think we'll do a whole episode on it at some point, right? A
Well,
special episode, maybe in 2 years or so, we'll do more Ozus.
For me, I just wanted to present those two sort of poles of what Setsuko Hara's characters can mean in Ozu's films. On the one hand, she can represent this sort of idealized self-portrait as a genuinely self-complete being, to whom a romantic relationship doesn't particularly add anything. Now, she can have very strong attachments, but those strong attachments are, like I have said in the individual episodes, primary attachments. So her self-completion is represented or symbolized by being in a kind of childlike state, right? Where she can have intense, fulfilling relationships with a parent or a sibling. But romantic relationships, just no. And even when we do see her willingly form a romantic attachment in Early Summer, it's through this avenue of a parent substitute and a brother substitute.
Good friend of her brother.
But then, on the other hand, yeah, we do get that moment in Tokyo Story that seems to acknowledge that this self-completion is not perfect, that it comes with very painful existential loneliness.
Well, it does, but I do think that we interpret Tokyo Story a little differently from one another, because I don't feel like that Noriko has anything to do with the crushed human being that we see at the end of An Autumn Afternoon.
The connection is probably stronger for me because I am reading them so strongly as stand-ins for the artist. Because that's what I take her to be in his films. And I feel like Shishu Ryu, like I say, takes her place in this final film. And let it be said that Ozu drank himself to death. Like, this is a film, that final film is a film made by a person who knows they're dying, why and how.
These groups of men all drinking themselves to death in his final films. Yeah, clearly these are more and more. Like, Shishu Ryu did not act like this in the earlier films. There was the one incident in Tokyo Story.
Well, he's still lovely and heartbreaking.
But he's a lot more discombobulated, and there's not really much of a center to him. He's really all over the place. Now, we do want to make this kind of a valedictory for Ozu and Setsuko Hara, because this is our last chance to talk about them for a while together. For me, Noriko in Tokyo Story is kind of a bodhisattva figure or something, right? She is telling it like it is. She's not tormented by it the way Shishu Ryu is in An Autumn Afternoon. She's saying, look, life is disappointing, and it's delivered with that Noriko smile.
No, I don't agree, because for me, obviously that is what the note, there's more than one note going on with her at the end there, and for you, that's the note that stands out. For me, the note that stands out is her speech where she says, some days I don't think I can get through another day.
Yeah.
So there's more than one note. All the notes are there.
Maybe, but I also think that she's saying those kinds of things more to get on a level of relatability that she's talking
I don't agree.
to.
I think that she's talking from her heart there.
Mm.
She's admitting something that she almost can never even admit to herself, let alone anybody else.
Maybe.
Because I think this is very important to Ozu's post-war work, as we see again at the very end of his film career and life. This terrible existential loneliness. Now, as we said when we talked about Tokyo Story, Noriko transmutes this into something amazing. So to that extent, she is still an idealized self-portrait. She transmutes this somehow into empathy, which is a great deal more than poor Shishu Ryu is able to do in Autumn Afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, he's a likable guy, but he's not inspiring anyone around him. He is not making any of them feel more comfortable with the malaise of existence.
So he's very far from being an idealized self-portrait.
And in End of Summer, she is definitely playing more of that role, right? She is definitely someone who is, for better or for worse, she's settled on the kind of life that she wants to have. She's going to raise her child. She's never getting married again. And she is taking it upon herself to ensure that Noriko makes a good decision in her life. That's her entire focus in this film. We get the tools to understand what Noriko needs to do. It's go to Sapporo and marry this guy that she worked with, who's been transferred far, far north, and she'll never see her family again. And that's obviously going to be tough on Setsuko Hara, as she does seem fairly centered and able to handle whatever comes her way. The person she seems to care about the most is Noriko, and she's going to have to lose that proximity anyway.
Yeah, but there's just not a lot of emphasis placed on that emotionally in this.
I think there is.
In this film.
There is, because all they do is have two shots together.
Yeah, I know, but the impact of that on her isn't dwelt on the way it often is in these films. The impact of the separation. And I mean, theoretically, she does have this child to raise, but their scenes together are laughable, are absolutely ridiculous.
Well, they're meant to be very funny.
They might as well be in different movies as well. He never shows her as being any good with children, and of course, in this case, she has one of his obnoxious little boy characters as her child, and has no better luck with him than with any of the other little boys in these movies. Barely even get a shot to recognize him by.
Some of the funniest stuff I've seen in an Ozu film comes when she is trying to get them to behave themselves when they're fishing or throwing rocks down by the river, and they just look back at her like she's a complete asshole.
But that's how she always relates to children in his films. So all of this, isn't there one, which one is it, where she is actually going to be raising a child? And she has a long discussion of it with her friend? Which one is that?
The man that she decides to marry in early summer has a daughter.
Because he's a widower.
But she's not an obnoxious daughter, actually. She seems pretty cool.
Yes, that's true, but I still have a hard time believing that this character we've been presented with is going to be devoting herself to child raising. It's just very theoretical. Any kind of domestic relationship other than the ones we actually see with her father or daughter or what have you seem anything to do with marriage. It just seems very theoretical.
And I think what makes it more meaningful as well, the closeness between these siblings, is the story surrounding it. This story of this will-o'-the-wisp father who just floats through people's lives, has no impact whatsoever, and eventually is cremated and floats into the sky with the crows looking on. I do think that that's part of the brilliance of the film, that they're not exactly halves, because the Setsuko Hara and Noriko story takes up a smaller part of it, but it does feel compartmentalized within this narrative of utter meaninglessness that we were talking about at the beginning. And that's supposed to emphasize, I think, what's going on there between them. Their final conversation, where we see the benefits that have come from this close relationship for Noriko, the strength that she draws upon in order to resist being thrown into this marriage that will be beneficial for the family, financially beneficial, all comes from Akiko.
True.
And that whole thing happens while they're in mourning clothes walking as part of the funeral procession. It's an amazing discussion there, and an amazing placement of that discussion.
And it should be said, in talking about this Setsuko Hara persona in his films, too, that despite what we might call this self-completion, her characters do, again, always with the exception of Tokyo Twilight, where we see her very differently, the character does have this Noriko Akiko ability to form new close relationships. Like, we do really believe that she has formed this new relationship with Yuriko at the end of late autumn that will bring something positive into her life, just like her separation from her family is less devastating in Tokyo Story because she has formed this relationship with this mother-in-law, right? Which seems to be necessary for her as a bridge to the marital relationship. Again, that's in total contrast to how Shishibuya ends up at the end of An Autumn Afternoon, where he feels this same piercing loneliness that he just can't find his way out of, inability to make connections, and yet is so unable to make connections that even when they're being offered to him, he can't do it.
No.
I mean, her character seems to be about the ability to make connections in the face of inesaugible loneliness.
Right, again...
And that being enough to survive on and all that you can possibly hope for in this life.
Yeah, I think that is the quintessence of the Setsuko Hara character
and
for Ozu.
And if you don't have that, but you still have this difficulty with making connections, you're either going to end up like the solipsist in End of Summer or like Shishirio in An Autumn Afternoon, right?
Yeah, she's a person who realizes the strength of her own integrity, in the grandest sense of that word, and she also realizes how much people are drawn to that quality in her, and she doesn't shy away from allowing it to benefit other people. It's a with great power comes great responsibility kind of argument.
Yeah, well, clearly you see her as more of a superhero than I do. I see her as I said, this terribly suffering person.
Well, I don't think there's any contradiction there. Being able to come to terms with the existential character of human existence is not the same thing as being happy-go-lucky, completely joy-filled individual. Obviously, she's not that, and she would suffer just as anyone would suffer from the pain of subjectivity, right? Being cut off and isolated in your own body and senses. But she's found a way to meet that halfway and really get something out of it rather than allow it to crush her. And what she's able to do fairly often in these films is bring a little of that refracted realization into the lives of other people. And yeah, when she's not there, it turns into An Autumn Afternoon.
And it is very hard to imagine another actress being able to play that role in somebody's art.
Yeah, of course not. You can't. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. And obviously, Ozu realized that. He doesn't try to do that with any other actor that he works with. He tells different kinds of stories when she's not around.
Yeah.
And he even does try a few experiments, right? Like Tokyo Twilight. She's not that character at all.
Yeah,
so
true.
It's not like she has to do that, but that is a major part of her significance in the films where he is working with her as Noriko or Akiko.
I wouldn't say that it's true that only his films with her convey what he has to say about life that is positive, because...
No, I don't mean that either.
Well, no, I'm just pointing that out, because certainly there are many of his other films that lean toward the positive side of Ozu's outlook. Like, I'm thinking of Flavor of Green Tea Over Rice, for example.
Yeah, of course. Or the Munakata sisters. That sibling relationship is very impressive and nourishing as well, but there it's really a more two-way street. I do feel like with Setsuko Hara, one thing that is unique about the way he presents her is that it's almost always, it's a great relationship because of her.
Well, I don't know, she's a bit of a jackass in Late Spring, as we've said. Like, her friend has to do a lot of the work.
Oh yeah, but that's not the transcendental relationship in that film. That's going on with her and Shishirio.
Sure. But she doesn't see it that way. She sees her father as giving her all of this joy.
Yeah, well, again, that one's fairly special in the canon because it does seem to be kind of different order of relationship.
But in Tokyo Story, certainly she is...
It's asymmetrical there. She is helping other people.
Giving something very special to these elderly people that they can't get from anywhere else.
Yeah, and to their youngest daughter, who is getting some really important information from her and some modicum of hope, possibly, while she's experiencing this intense despair, and getting the message from Noriko that, yeah, you're seeing things correctly. That's how it is. Do we want to say anything else about End of Summer? There's a lot of stuff in the film that has nothing to do with Setsuko Hara that we haven't really talked about too much.
No, I don't think we need to go into all of it. I will say that there seems to be this impression, this truism about Ozu's films that he doesn't judge his characters, and I think that's nonsense. He really, really judges his character, and his characters judge each other.
Yeah.
I think on the contrary, where you might get that impression from is something like the Tokyo Story exchange that we talked about, where you have a young person voice their disappointment in people, just wanting to basically dismiss humanity altogether based on the fact that it's awful, right? So I would say that that what Ozu does is he judges humanity as awful and then says, but that's no reason to completely dismiss it.
Yeah, so we're awful. We still have to find some way to help each other get through being awful.
One of the places in these films where that judgment falls is along lines of sexual propriety. Because that is presented as an option in Autumn Afternoon, how you could console yourself for losing a daughter by gaining a granddaughter that you have sex with.
Yeah, it's not presented as a very palatable option in that society, that's for sure, and not in ours either.
And interestingly, the Scylla and Charybdis that Shishu-ryu has to negotiate in that film is the indignity of becoming a broken down old drunk that his daughter wastes her life caring for, and the indignity of what his friend is doing, which is pretending to a youth that he no longer has. By refusing either of those options, he ends up in a state where he doesn't have any comfort left in his life. He prefers that self-destruction to these undignified options, and we see the same thing in End of Summer, that the problem with the way this father is behaving, a lot of the problem with the way this father is behaving is, it's not so much moralized as like aestheticized as undignified for a human being. And again, so that is also another thing that Setsuko Hara is able to represent in his films, is that it would be very hard for many actresses to do, is this transcendence of sexuality that isn't asexual, you know? Purity in the grandest sense.
In the Gertrude line, right?
Yeah.
We've mentioned
Dreyer.
that. Yeah, we've mentioned that before, and obviously Schrader does put Ozu and Dreyer together in his essay.
But Gertrude has a lot of lovers. It's just that she
Yeah, but-
transcends them all.
Yeah, by the end. Even when she has lovers, she is not.
She's not on the same plane as them. There's so much to Ozu. There's just so much going on there emotionally, psychologically, philosophically. We're not going to get to it all.
No, but we will talk about Ozu again, you can be sure. And next week, Elise?
Next week, hopefully we'll give you something a little easier to edit, Dave.
Well, it's going to be our studio's Year by Year series, Warner Brothers 1934. We're going to be talking about Heat Lightning and Side Streets.
Irvin Leroy and
Alfred E. Green.
two directors you like.
Two great Warner Brothers directors from the early 30s. Heat Lightning is one of my very favorite Warner Brothers films. It has incredible roles for Eileen McMahon and Anne Dvorak, especially Eileen McMahon. These are stars that don't get nearly enough attention, as far as I'm concerned, so we'll bring a little bit more
We
of
did
that.
talk about another Eileen McMahon movie in one of our Warner's episodes, one where she's prominently featured,
Yep.
which was...
Life Begins. There, she's not the main focus. Heat Lightning, she's got a more central role.
Cool. Well, sounds great.
I look forward to discussing that with you all next week, and especially you, Elise.
That's great.